Good morning, colleagues. I'm Mukhtar Aban, the coordinator of the Humanizing Pedagogy project at Nelson Mandela University, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all to webinar 5 in the Exploring a Humanizing Pedagogy series. We are ecstatic today to welcome our presenter, a mover and shaker in academia, extremely passionate about education, Dr. Sarah Black. We also welcome Dr. Heather Jacklin, a well-known and respected academic and former senior lecturer of the School of Education at UCT. Dr. Jacklin will serve as the respondent in today's webinar. Welcome to all our attendees, colleagues, staff, and students from Nelson Mandela University, as well as colleagues joining us from the University of Cape Town, University of Johannesburg, Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and Wits University, to name a few. We also extend a warm welcome to the teachers, postgraduate students, and researchers joining us from various parts of South Africa, Africa, and the United States today. A personal and special welcome to my cool open learning research team colleagues and friends joining from UCT. On behalf of the HP project, the Learning and Teaching CoLab, and the Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela University, we are excited to have each of you with us today. There are a few house rules that we need to follow. In the Zoom room, the mics have been muted for the duration of the presentation and response. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat while the presenter and respondent are speaking. Facebook viewers may post comments and questions on the live stream to participate in the webinar. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, and all questions will be posed then. Kindly note the presentation and response will take place iteratively, and we'll have the Q&A after the final response. At that stage, should you wish to speak, you may raise your hand or request the mic in the chat, and I'll send you a request to unmute. You may also send your questions directly to me by selecting my name from the drop-down menu. We are looking forward to an engaging session this morning. On that note, I'm deeply honored to welcome Dr. Sarah Black. Dr. Sarah Black is a former high school maths teacher who now trains teachers and works in critical education sociology, with a focus on equity and justice in education policy. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Education Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and also a research fellow at the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching at UCT. She lectures various postgraduate seminars, including education policy, education leadership and change, and ethics in education. As a former software programmer, she also brings a critical social justice perspective to technology in education. When not working on education issues, she's an avid trail runner, a seamstress, and a musician. Dr. Black, a warm Mandela University welcome.
Thank you so much, Mukhtar, and thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their day. I'm very aware that we are webinared out, and so when inboxes are inundated with invitations for these sorts of things, it's a real actual privilege when people make the time. The topic I've chosen for today is a question that has been bothering me sometime since last March, when schools and universities moved online in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so today I'd like to take some time to ask whether a humanizing pedagogy, which I'll be more specific about later, is possible online, and if so, how and under what conditions, and how does that relate to our prevailing conditions of education at the moment. So I'm going to try and use a few different theoretical tools to get at this, and as I do so, I'll try and make that as accessible as possible, because it's quite a challenge when using theory to be clear and be precise with the words you're using and the language that you're trying to put to work. But while there's been a lot of research and there's a lot of commentary, there's a lot of speculation about online learning, a lot of it hasn't seemed to me to take the question of learning very seriously. And so that's what I've been trying to think about as I've been working through the material I'll share with you today. Now, I must admit that I find myself in an unusual situation, which is that I hope I'm wrong. And I say that because the places that I see online taking us regarding pedagogy are not places that I think we necessarily want to go. And so I think that as we work through this, I will appreciate critical feedback and engagement from the audience. And particularly, I want to thank Dr. Heather Jacqueline for being my respondent today and for thinking through some of these things with me over the last couple of months. All right, let's move forward. I want to begin with what I'm not doing today, because I think it's very important to make it clear what this presentation is not claiming. I'm not making some kind of a priori argument that a practice that we might call humanizing, which I'll unpack a little more later, is never possible through a digitally mediated interaction. I'm not claiming that. I think that's a kind of analytic argument which tries to derive ideas from first principles that's not particularly helpful, and it's also not very empirically engaged in what's actually happening on the ground. Rather, I'd like to say, what is pedagogy? What kinds of concepts can we use to talk about it? How is it shaped by prevailing social forces? And what implications that shaping has for online formats of teaching and learning? I'll use the term a digitally relayed pedagogy as we go through this presentation. And I'm hoping that what that means will become clearer as I take you through the thinking today. I'm also not suggesting that what I present today is the only way to think about this issue. I think that's really important. One could bring a myriad of different conceptual frameworks and see subtly different things about online learning. But the way I will present it today has certainly resonated with my own subjective experience of teaching online. It's also a way that I think marries my experience of teaching in contact modes in different situations throughout my teaching career. And it also, for me at least, starts to encapsulate some of the anecdotes and stories I've heard from other teachers as well. So I'll start off by setting up some of the tools I use. In particular, I want to try and get at this problem in a way that doesn't valorize contact learning as if it is on the whole humanizing and online is not. That's a false dichotomy. It's not like online bad, contact good, and it's not that neat and tidy. Rather, I think it's important to ask how existing practices are being moved online. How does a digital relayed pedagogy exacerbate different aspects of the way that contact practices are currently arranged and enacted? And that I'm talking about teaching through digital technology, not teaching with it. So also being very specific about the idea that we're talking about a digitally mediated interaction, just like the Zoom call, not a teacher pulling up a YouTube video in her classroom in order to explain a concept for her students. Okay. I'm going to argue that while a humanizing pedagogy is improbable under certain conditions, I'm concerned that digital modes of teaching and learning will start to foreclose even the smaller possibilities that remain. Okay, well, let's set up some tools first. Let's set up some conceptual ideas that I use to build this argument. It's quite a toolbox. Stay with me as we work through this. There are three components. The first part I use is some work of Karl Marx, who in Capital Volume 1 wrote some really interesting ideas around what happens where we have processes that we are trying to scale. And he talks about labor division, and he talks about mechanization introduced into processes that are now being sort of streamlined, if you like, across multiple people or multiple actors. The second set of concepts I'm going to draw on come from the education sociologist Bernstein. And he has been used in particular ways in South African education research, but I'm going to use him a little bit differently here. I think he offers us really useful words to talk about pedagogy and what's happening inside the classroom and how the outside gets in. So I'm going to use his concept of the pedagogic device and how the way that device is configured influences, to varying degrees, what happens in classrooms when teachers are framing, sequencing, and pacing learning with their students. And finally, I'm going to look at humanizing pedagogy through a somewhat different lens to perhaps the way other prior speakers in this webinar have deployed it. It's traditionally associated with Frere, who originated the concept in his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But I want to try and look at it through a different way, through a paper from the Dutch philosopher Geert Biesta. And now Biesta draws on the work of Zygmunt Bauman to think about what ethics means in education practice. And Biesta's calling for a return to a democratic and humane responsibility in education. He uses Bauman's idea of proximity to reason that rules and codes and codes of conduct or even policies can never really tell us how we ethically engage with our students when we are in pedagogic moments. So there's a little bit of a twist there, but I hope it'll become apparent why I want to take Biesta's responsibility as a way of thinking about humanizing pedagogy. Now, the first two sets of ideas that I've pulled into this toolbox are descriptive. They give me words to talk about what I think already exists. And I'm going to start there. But this third toolbox is a normative one. It necessarily sits in the domain of what we think should be the case. Not what is, but what we want to be the case, what we think is the ideal or good or better. And so it is sitting in the domain of ethics. It's saying what we think would be a better approach to pedagogy. And that's premised on a whole lot of assumptions, like everybody being a human being of equal moral worth. It's premised on ideas like social justice. Some theorists of social justice, like Nancy Fraser, use terms like parity of participation. And we're going to look a little bit more at what this responsible, ethical approach to pedagogy looks like. And then once I've set up these tools for you in a little bit more detail, I'm going to offer a visual lattice, like a diagram that allows us to think against different aspects of education and how these different concepts, these different ideas, let us start talking about both contact and digitally relayed forms of pedagogy as they are starting to unfold in our institutions. Okay, so that's where we're going. That's the layout of today's presentation. Toolbox number one is Marx, particularly division of labor and machines. And he's talking at length about what happens when processes go to scale. He's particularly talking about when you take a particular process and you try to scale it up, you end up with divisions of labor that people who were operating in a much smaller scale might have done all the same types of, all the tasks involved in a particular process. You end up assigning different people to different stages of the process. Now, what's interesting about that is that one person who might have embodied a holistic sense of the entire process from start to finish, understanding how the different parts relate to each other, having an appreciation of the whole beyond just all the different facets involved, starts to fragment. That person stops existing in the process. You don't have a person who notices everything from start to finish, but you have different people performing different stages of the process. Now, I'm not saying whether it's a good or bad thing that one person has the sort of specialist knowledge to understand an entire process all in themselves and the power that that might give them. I'm not saying whether that's a good or a bad thing. Rather, Marx is just trying to draw our attention to what happens when we divide up work into stages in the name of efficiency, but in a way that means we lose the holistic picture about what's happening from start to finish in that process. Marx then goes on in the next chapter to say, well, what then happens when you take that expanded process that is starting to experience labor division? It gets divided, it gets atomized, made small, each stage getting smaller and smaller and more specific. The specialist is no longer able to appreciate the arc from start to finish of what's happening, but rather you have several people alienated from each other, alienated from the whole process, lacking the big picture, and then machines come into that as well. And that labor division becomes entrenched because now the machine is specific to the step involved. And a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the know-how about different things happening in that process become embodied in the machine rather than embodied in the person. So now in Marx's time, when he was talking about 19th century cotton factories, you know, the person who once might have been able to take the whole cotton all the way to the final product is now a person sitting at a super spinning loom and only knows how to thread the machine. And that's what they know. So the know-how about how cotton becomes what it is now in the machine and not in the person. And that person is lacking the ability to make contextual judgments about how to fix something when it goes wrong, or how to understand that the effect of a step further up in the process has an impact further down. Marx would say that the knowledge, once mechanized into the machine, becomes disembodied and dead. It's unresponsive, it's unable to adapt. And creativity at each stage of the process also gets constrained as it becomes more objectified into the machines that are producing each step of the process. So I think those two ideas are interesting because they are going to resonate a little bit with what we think about education as a process. Okay, the valorization is it's efficient. When you organize processes this way, you get efficiency gains. But what happens when we start to notice these phenomena in processes or practices that are inherently not efficient? Processes and practices like learning. Okay, so I think Marx is offering us some useful tools there: division of labor and mechanization. The second piece of the toolbox is Bernstein's Pedagogic Device. And I think he offers us some useful language to talk about the components of education systems. I hope you can see where I'm going with this. Okay, the pedagogic device consists of three components: distributive rules about what knowledge is to be learned and by whom or not, recontextualizing rules about how that is relayed, and evaluation rules, which are relatively context, time and content dependent. So you've got three aspects of pedagogy where there is decisions being made about what is being learned, by whom and when. You've got recontextualizing, which is, well, how do I sort of frame this and sequence this and present this to a student in a way that will make sense to them? And then evaluative. Well, how do you know? How do you know that this knowledge has been acquired and understood in a particular way? So I think what Bernstein's getting at here is some very useful words to talk about learning and pedagogy as a process inside this kind of behemoth we call education. And as we go on, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you have the sort of arrangements or organization of education where you've got people picking the decisions that are going to affect curriculum, especially in a systematized education system, whether that's higher or basic. You've got the people who are going to be translating that into pedagogic moments in the classroom, and they'll be sequencing it and pacing it and framing it in particular ways, but all within the constraints about what has been selected and what has been distributed. And then you've got this moment of sort of checking for acquisition, which of course happens formatively in the classroom, but also there's an entire aspect of the system which is about summative assessment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how organizing education systems along these three axes shape and constrain or enable the moment of pedagogy with the student in the classroom in varying different degrees and ways. Okay, so I'm saying that how this device is instantiated in a particular society, in a particular moment, and across these different components is going to shape what teachers can and can't do in particular moments. It's not to say that it totally determines. It doesn't, it's not deterministic in the sense that there's no capacity for pushing back against or trying to resist a particular way of approaching education. But one is not totally free to act in the classroom. Any teacher will know this. You don't get to just pick whatever the students learn, how they learn it, what they learn, and then how you know. You are always working up and against prevailing social practices. And I think anyone who's taught will resonate with these different aspects of their practice. So while not saying this is some kind of a determined script that tells us exactly how pedagogy always unfolds, these are really useful aspects to notice that are fundamental to how education gets organized and helps us to grapple with what we do as pedagogues, as teachers. So that's my second set of ideas. All right, at this point, sorry, just to backtrack there, production, transmission, acquisition, these are the three short terms that Bernstein offers us for these three aspects of the pedagogic device. I'm going to then just quickly pass back to Dr. Jacqueline to see if she wants to offer some thoughts or some comments, or perhaps even rhetorical questions about those two sets of ideas.
Thanks, Sarah. Perhaps I can just kick off by saying that the process of this is not I'm not being a typical respondent. I'm continuing a conversation, and for me, that's been incredibly. I've learned a huge amount from that conversation. I've made it very difficult for Sarah because, of course, as the conversation moves forward, my ideas keep moving forward. And, you know, Sarah says she's going to say A, and I say, yeah, that's fine. And then the next day I say, no, it's not fine because I've had this new idea. so I'm a very difficult respondent, but it's been a very exciting conversation, which continues here. A couple of points I want to pick up. First of all, I think something that's really important to understand in listening to what Sarah is saying is her distinction between what is possible with technology and what is, I would say, what is probable. She mentions that she's observing trends, what's actually happening. So it's one thing to say, but technology could work in this way. Another thing to look around, look at the economy, looking at the shifts that are happening, looking at the shifts, the responses to COVID, and saying, but what is happening? So I think keeping that distinction clear is interesting. Something that I've also found really positive about the way Sarah is thinking about this is her distinction between the descriptive and the normative. So taking some sets of ideas to say, let's use these to look under the bonnet, if you like, to look how pedagogy normally works, what its components are, and to look at how technology, how we can understand technology in terms of how it normally works. And then to shift from that to the normative, but what do we think should happen as teachers with values and goals and ideological commitments? What would we like to achieve in the classroom? And how can we read the relation between what usually happens, ways of lenses for looking at that, and then turning to, but how does this impact on what we would like to see happening? So that's an important move for me. Finally, something that's been really interesting for me in the conversation so far that's come through in this section of the presentation is the relationship between, and just for the Bernsteinians out there, I'm going to use a few Bernsteinian terms, but then I'll come back to the rest of us. The relationship between the pedagogic device and framing. So this conversation with Sarah has given me a new insight into that, which I'd like to just underline here. And that is that I formally, as somebody who had an interest in Bernstein's thoughts, thought of the pedagogic device in a way as that which is outside the classroom, the division of labor, the organization of who does what outside the classroom. And that impacts on what happens inside the classroom. But there's a kind of implicit assumption that what happens inside the classroom is that, if you're talking about schools at least, you have one teacher and some sort of a group of students, and they are working with technology up to a point. Every time a teacher picks up a pencil, she's working with technology. And I think what Sarah's linking of the pedagogic device to, that is how we organize things outside the classroom, who writes the textbooks, who sets the curriculum, who sets the exams, and so on, how that reaches into the classroom differently once the more we teach through technology. So we have this distinction about teaching with and teaching through, and that Sarah also makes, and how the division of labor gets much more structured inside the classroom the more we teach through technology. Every teacher, of course, teaches with technology. So the question arises for me as to when does teaching with become teaching through? And for me, that's a question a little bit about to what extent is the technology controlling the teacher as opposed to the teacher controlling the technology. So that's been a helpful insight for me in terms of my previous reading of Bernstein about how the pedagogic device actually intrudes more strongly into the classroom, organizes the division of labor in potentially inside the classroom more strongly and more rigidly. So that's something that I found very interesting about this conversation.
Thank you, Heather. Absolutely right about noticing who's controlling whom, and also how fuzzy the difference becomes between teaching with and teaching through. I'm now going to take that set of ideas and we'll develop it a little more later, but we want to add that normative layer now. We want to ask, how does this foreclose or enable or constrain humanizing approaches to learning moments? Let's have a look at that next phase. All right, so humanizing through pedagogy. Normally people come at this with Freire, but I'm going to, as I said in the beginning, unpack that a little bit differently. And I find particularly there's a very useful commonality through the different humanizing definitions I found. So I was looking at the Freire, and then people have used him, people like Delport, Zinn, Salazar, that there is normally some kind of content, talking about perhaps decolonizing curriculum, talking about establishing greater parity between different epistemes and knowledge bodies, as well as a process component. So we're trying to not only engage with knowledge in a different way, different types of knowledge, but engage with it in a different way. But I'm arguing that humanizing has to sit in the terrain of ethics, okay? Because it is normative, and ethics is about what we think is good or better. And so one of the different researchers who come at this, although they haven't explicitly labeled themselves as ethicists, I think there is always an ethics component. And there are a lot of people who've talked about humanizing pedagogy, but haven't used the humanizing pedagogy label. If you're thinking about some of the issues about, for example, Patty Silbert's work about how schools construct particular subjects according to social norms. Woody has also talked about some of this with his symbolic violence work. But I want to bring a different angle, because I think that what Biesta offers us is something a lot sharper to think about the moment of pedagogy in the classroom. And he's going to give us a language to talk about a type of noticing, a type of openness and paying attention. And I would like to suggest that before one can notice that knowledges are sitting on a terrain that's unequal, or notice that the processes one is using to engage in teaching and learning are unfair to the student or are eclipsing different aspects of who they are, you have to be noticing it all. You have to be paying attention. So I would say that a fundamental prerequisite for a responsible engagement with your student, to a humanizing practice with your student, is paying attention. And Biesta can talk about this a little bit more. He talks about responsibility in education. And he uses a word, drawing on Zygmunt Bauman, that a humanizing, ethical, responsible approach to your students requires what he calls proximity. Okay, proximity is that moment where you are confronted with the other in a non-deterministic and uncertain way. When you have that student in front of you, and neither the rules or the policies or the code of conduct, nor the chatter in the staff room can actually tell you how to do right or good by this student. You're sat in this relating of proximity to the other, where your ethical disposition actually makes you uncertain. And in doing so, you have to be open and engaged and listening. You have to be seeing that other person in a way that makes you pay attention to what they need and how to be ethical with and for them. And so I think there's something that resonated a lot with Biesta's work around proximity for me, where as a teacher, this is something that resonates for me a lot. It's something that I have always wanted to try and do for my students, but I am often struggling to establish proximity, okay? And it also throws up a huge number of dilemmas where I'm in this moment with the other. I'm trying to listen to what they need. I'm trying to pay attention and see them as a holistic person. And I'm trying to execute my responsibility towards them. But I also have to try and help them navigate a dehumanizing world. And I am not totally free to act as however I would like to. So I'm going to use the concept of proximity in the pedagogic moment between a pedagogue and a student to think about humanizing, saying that if you want to question the content or question the processes of education as fundamentally unfair, that is premised on noticing that that student is being positioned in a particular way by that content, by that process. I'm going to then ask Heather what she thinks about that as a normative approach to a humanizing pedagogy.
Yeah, this is another insight that I've found really, really interesting to think with as I've listened to Sarah. The importance, the ethical importance of seeing the student, or even a definition of ethics as involving seeing the students holistically, and then gearing teaching to who the student is, what they bring, and to their context, which is personal, which is social, and of course, which is also pedagogic. So that's an integrative response. And those two words, integration as a kind of form of adaptation, and response, have been words that this process has got me to think about more carefully. And I think of Donna Haraway, who takes the word response and adds ability to arrive at the word responsibility. And for me, that notion of responsibility as ability to response is quite central to what Sarah is highlighting here. So the ability to respond, the teacher's ability to respond, the teacher's ability to adjust and to integrate. And the question that therefore has been puzzling me a little, because I know much less about technology than probably pretty well anyone in this room. And so a question which I have difficulty in answering, but I think is important, is what kinds of response abilities to integrate and adapt to who the student is, what the student brings, where the student is, can technology not enable, or you know, which of those can be built into the technology, which can be supported or enabled by the technology, and which are constrained by by particular forms of technology in particular particular cases. So that question is one which I puzzle about, but have very little to offer in terms of answers. I suspect there are people who understand technology really well who could say a lot about what kinds of responses technology can support and enable, and perhaps even strengthen. But I also think the other question about which responses, which opportunities to adapt and integrate teaching to who the student is are constrained. So those are the questions that have arisen for me from thinking about this section of Sarah's work.
Thank you, Heather. And I don't know if we'll get to answers to all of those today, but I'm really glad that you've managed to articulate them so clearly and place them in the minds of the people here, so that more heads are kind of asking and thinking through responses to those questions. All right, we've set up a conceptual toolbox, and I now want to offer a lattice for thinking again. So this is not a hard and fast model, rather it's just a tool to think with. I want to offer a two-dimensional lattice where we have on the horizontal axis what I call a mode of communication, and on the vertical a ratio of communication. Now the mode runs from only contact, so verbal, we're not even writing pen pal letters to each other, which is a technologically mediated mode of communication, albeit quite an old one. Talking about a face-to-face chat verbally. And a purely technologically mediated mode of communication. And it's a continuum, of course. We'll notice that, those are two polar opposites, but there's a whole slew of blended, differentiated forms in between along that axis. Now, the ratio of communication axis runs from a one-on-one engagement to one-to-many. Now, one-to-many might be a sort of formal model C school where it's 1 to 20, but it also could, outside of the education sphere, be Donald Trump's Twitter account, which is 1 to, I don't know, however many million. All right, so ratio of communication is not capped, but it's certainly limited to one-on-one at the lower end of things. And so I want to offer this as a mechanism for us to think about what's happening with education interactions, with pedagogic moments, using the tools we've set out. I'd like to start here. Contact only one-on-one. And let's think about what kinds of pedagogies are possible under these sorts of constraints. Okay. A one-on-one in-person engagement. I would argue that the different aspects of the pedagogic device are tightly imbricated in the way that the teacher can enact framing, sequencing, and pacing. Okay. Bearing in mind, I'm not saying that every one-on-one in-person engagement is a humanizing engagement. Proximity is part of how a teacher and student come to that moment. It's not just assumed. But if you're really paying attention, if you are trying to establish that ethical, responsible engagement with the pedagogic moment, how you are noticing the knowledges that are being conveyed, their implications in broader power structures, how it's presented to the student, the ways of explaining it, how you're noticing whether the student is understanding what you're saying, whether you are adapting what you're doing to the student's context, to the student's mood, to the student's situation, to the student's offering back to you as a formative indicator of where their thinking is at. Those processes are happening in such tight succession as almost to be indistinguishable. Okay. And this will be again familiar to students who've sat down next to a student and said, how am I communicating this with you? What's going on? Tell me where your thinking's at. Adapting and adjusting what she says or what she does to respond to the moment. And it's in those moments that I think that emergence is the most likely. As a facilitator, as an educator, as a pedagogue in that moment, my students could offer me something really unexpected, or I them. There's a capacity to surprise each other. There's this non-determinism where you kind of go, oh, I really didn't expect you to say that. I really didn't expect you to do that. What's going on here? And you're paying attention. You're trying to establish a proximity if you're really trying to engage in that in a responsible, ethical way. There's something unpredictable and non-deterministic about that moment that will constantly shape in a very unpredictable way the way that different aspects of pedagogy are being engaged and organized and enacted. You know, when you ask a student, what's going on in your head, talk me through your thinking. Why, where are you going with that? It's those kinds of moments that I think are the most likely in this sort of an arrangement. Okay. And so I would say in such a moment, the educator is present. She can be proximate, open, and attentive. Now, notice how the pedagogue in this moment is involved in the holistic process. She's seeing the whole picture. Okay, so there's emergent cues that are shaping what she's done. She's present. Hopefully she's trying to be proximate in a humanizing, ethical, responsible way. She's seeing the holistic picture. She's involved in and responsible for all the different things that are going into producing this education moment. And we'll talk more, I think, in the questions about how external issues constrain her. But remember Marx? Remember where there was a specialist who could see the whole picture? I think that's the most likely when you can engage with a student one-on-one, face-to-face. But that's not how we organize education. If that's the situation I've just talked about, and it's a somewhat thought experiment type of situation, although it comes out in particular moments, I'd say that empirically, most of our education moments are actually somewhere on this terrain of the lattice that I'm developing. So we've got a much higher ratio of communication. I mean, whether it's 1 to 20 in a fee charging school, or it's 1 to 70 in a fee free school, or 1 to 200 in a university lecture, or 1 to 5,000 in a MOOC. We'll talk more about that later. The point is that we have a much higher ratio between the pedagogue and the students. And the mode of communication is already not going to be just purely verbal contact. There's going to be some kind of mediation by technology. Even when a teacher is using workbooks, using homework, that's a form of mediation through technology. I'd say that in this situation, proximity diminishes, okay? And the teacher's engagement with the students in ethical terms is more set by codes and rules and norms. Contact necessarily diminishes under these kinds of arrangements of education, because a teacher cannot be with every student in every moment of every lesson all the time. And it's interesting to watch how newly qualified teachers try to remain proximate with all their students at all times, and end up being exhausted in the process. Okay. But homework, projects, notebooks are all forms of technological mediation, so that the teacher is not having to literally be present in a moment and proximate with every student of every moment of every lesson. Okay. So I think there's something interesting here about how the teacher's ability to engage in a proximate manner with the student, it's diminished. It's not gone, but it's certainly far less, it's far more constrained, and it's far less practicable for that teacher. Okay, and like I said, she's going to rely more on kind of codes and rules and norms to guide her practice rather than what does the student need right now. And contact becomes reliant on the technologically mediated forms, like I said. But what I think is really interesting is we start to see that becomes a division of labor under these kinds of arrangements. So if you might have had a frontier school where the teacher could choose what knowledge we're going to learn, how we're going to learn it, how she's going to evaluate the students who've learned it, etc., where she doesn't have some kind of a curriculum authority telling her what to do, or an umalusi telling her what to test, etc. When you start to arrange education in the ways that we have, you start to see a division of labor in terms of the different aspects of organizing education at scale for lots of people. So you have different people setting the curriculum, to those who are conveying it, to those who are setting the exit points of assessing it. That's already happening. That's already happening without digital relays. we need to notice that that's what's happening, because it relates to what happens when we do go to the digital form. Okay, and there's something interesting about that I think happens where Marx is telling us to notice the loss of the holistic vision across the entire pedagogic moment. Okay, activities are temporally organized, so we're going to have to set the curriculum before we relay it, which we're going to have to do all of that before we test it, and that tight imbrication I spoke of earlier starts to separate. Now, under these conditions, I'd argue that a humanizing pedagogy becomes very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's really hard because of that lack of proximity and that separation. Okay, as I said, that division is something Marx talked about a lot. We're starting to see this already, as I said, in our massified contact modes of organizing education. Basic education, we have centralized, standardized curricula, CAPS. I mean, everybody knows about the tyranny of CAPS. Higher education, there is increased pressure for conformity in terms of content, in terms of curriculum, who learns what, and who gets to decide. In terms of that transmission part of the framing, sequencing, pacing, teachers are increasingly deprofessionalized with little to no autonomy to make integrated decisions. I'm picking up Heather's word there, integrated decisions about the students' needs in the moment. Teachers are increasingly unable to establish proximity. Higher education, we're seeing that transmission phase being handed to junior staff, precaritized postgraduates and adjuncts, especially where this process is further down the line overseas. We're seeing a lot of this. And the evaluation, increasingly external markers, increasingly standardized tests, especially at exit points. And in higher education, on these massified courses, we're starting to see it outsourced to postgrads, or even more interestingly, automated with things like MCQs. I think that that division is antithetical to proximity. I think that when we start to carve up education work and education processes in this way, we are starting to shut down our ability to humanize the other by paying attention to them as holistic others. Okay, and I think this would resonate for people who are in massified contact forms of education. Now, I think this is the path we have started on in the way that we are going online into digitally relayed pedagogy. We are going to, if we want to establish the supposed efficiency gains that a lot of people love to celebrate about online forms, digitally relayed technology is the only way to do it. Workbooks are not going to cut it. Correspondence educations are going to cut it. You now need to use digital technologies to increase that ratio even more. And I think that there are interesting things to notice about what happens to the already existing problematic practices that are making proximity hard in contact forms, almost impossible in digital forms. Okay, people who are excited about going online, it's not a surprise that the claim is efficiency, as well as things like asynchronicity, where you can decouple the presence of the teacher with the student at the same time. Well, you can post the stuff online and the students can pick it up later. That's not going to help you establish proximity. And there's a lot of valorization of this. I mean, if you look at the draft open learning policy framework for the Department of Higher Education and Training, it's this desire for efficiency, getting more out of less, that is touted as the major great thing about going online with learning. But how do you produce supposedly more learning moments without expanding the number of teachers tremendously? This is what Marx is talking about when he talks about the role of machines, squeezing out more out of the same number of people, okay? Trying to simultaneously decrease the numbers of people involved in the process while getting more out of those who remain. I mean, this is resonating a lot with what people have been saying in universities, where half of people are getting laid off and the other half are being worked into the ground. Marx was talking about that. But there's also something interesting that happens when we start to sediment and intensify the already pre-existing divisions of labor in education work into digital technologies, okay? Material production becomes specialized. It's often done by people who are not necessarily teachers, but are specialists, for example, in graphic design or video production. So now we've got totally different sort of sets of skills and involved in different aspects of the education process. Pre-existing practices become ossified and sedimented into machines and objects. I think that's where Marx's observations become really salient. But notice how content selection, production, distribution is done by a different group of people to those who are the online mediators, who often have very little autonomy over even pacing or sequencing the material that they are sharing with the students. Freire would say you are locked into a banking model. You cannot engage in the emergent. You cannot be proximate with the students and allow them to engage with the knowledge in an unusual or creative way. But here's one thing that I think is really interesting when you think about online education through these tools that I've offered today, is that assessment doesn't scale. It really bites at assessment. Meaningful assessment, as anyone who's had to mark 200 scripts will tell you, is very, very difficult. And so instead of offering students the ability to demonstrate what they've learned in unexpected and surprising ways, if you want to scale assessment, particularly through a digital form, you have to go through closed questions, MCQs, automated tests, or of course, underpaid outsourced marking, which is done by a different group of people again. And so I think that's a really sharp bottleneck to notice in what's happening as we're moving education online, is that the point of assessment is creating particular problems for a proximate, emergent, and responsible engagement with our students. Okay. Now, I think that optimists who are hoping for a humanizing online pedagogy are looking at a pathway that looks more like this, okay? That one can somehow sustain proximity through a digital mediation. And I don't think that that's entirely impossible, but almost everything I've read that extols the virtues of online education have been incredibly small scale. And they engage in practices that would struggle to ramp up. Okay, people who go here often, I mean, witnessing colleagues who are trying to sustain proximity once we were forced online last year, are just absolutely working themselves into the ground. And Marx talked about that too. You know, trying to answer every WhatsApp message, every student's forum post, every blog post, etc. Trying to keep the students' engagement open, but in a way that the pedagogue can't sustain. And I think that this pathway is not necessarily relative to what's happening at a social scale for two reasons. First of all, it's ignoring prevailing macro forces at work in the production of education moments. It's ignoring, it's looking at particular instances while ignoring the broader trends and flows. But I think it's also questionable whether genuine proximity can be sustained online. I don't entirely have a very good theorizing for this, but even just as I'm speaking to you now, I'm finding this incredibly alienating. I can't see your faces. I can't read the audience. I can't get a sense of people understanding what I'm doing or not because I can't see you. People have said being locked down and interacting with my family through Zoom and WhatsApp it's somehow a poor substitute for in-face contact. And so I think at the micro level of interaction as well, there's something about the way humans interact and the way that when we are paying attention to each other, our ability to see and read and interact is more than just sensory data of can I hear you, can I see you. And so I wonder if this path as well, where we might have some kind of a small scale, proximate, technologically mediated learning, is also just not entirely noticing what is lost when we interact in this way. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to prove what is not possible, but rather I'm going to notice how tech is reifying and sedimenting existing social practices, and then rather than disrupting them as prevailing neoliberal discourse would have it. Now, I said something about foreclosure in my blurb, and now I'm going to call it to an end and we can have some conversation, hear more of Dr. Jacqueline's thoughts and others. I think that it's when proximity is lost in a way that can't be undone. That's what we need to start noticing. I think that's what we need to pay attention to, that we're locking existing pedagogic practices, which we know are problematic, into digital materials, into pathways and systems that will be expensive to edit and change, and are difficult to construct emergent, non-deterministic moments with. And so I think that ethical and humanizing engagement, while already improbable in the way that we've organized our education system, starts to become really foreclosed when we take that problematic mode and we sediment it into machines. We divide it up in such a way that we can never rebuild the holistic view of learning in its entirety again. And that's what I mean by foreclosure. I think it's something we really, really need to notice. Brief summary of the argument. I established this thing called proximity from Biesta, and I said that I think this is foundational to a humanizing pedagogic engagement. I then set up that lattice about ratio and relays of communication, and saying that the ratio of pedagogue to students and the modes of communication affect the possibility and probabilities of proximity. I then noticed how Marx, talking about the division of labor when we scale certain processes, starts to happen along the lines of the pedagogic device, but that those divisions become sedimented and ossified into digital artifacts that reify that division, and they disembody specialized and specialist pedagogic knowledge, which is effectively the professionalism of the teacher and her ability to humanize her students and herself through her pedagogic practice. Here are a few very recent stories that popped into my inbox that make my point exactly. I'll leave these with Mukhtar to post on the blog if you wish to read them, but they're exactly more empirical examples that speak to the argument I've made today. Sure, thank you. That is the material of the discussion. I'm going to hand back to Dr. Jacqueline if she wants to offer some preliminary responses, and then I'm going to also offer, it'd be great to have another chance to discuss with more people as well. I'd like to particularly thank Dr. Josh Platsky-Miller and Thomas King as well, who were formative in some of this thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So, yeah, I'd like to just make 3 points, really, 2 of which are quite quick. And then I think the time will most usefully be spent opening the discussion up. The first is about an experience I had in trying to explain Sarah's lattice or image or graph to a household member of mine who is an inveterate skeptic. And I found that a really useful experience, because what I discovered was that each time he said, but what about this case? I could actually map it on the lattice, on the image, and talk about it in that way. It just made that conversation a lot easier to have. And so I found that really useful also in that way. And it also enabled us, that is me and the skeptical other, to talk about how mediation, whether it matters as much or in the same ways, depending on, for example, whether you're teaching a 7-year-old to read, whether you're teaching anatomy to a class of medics, whether you're teaching poetry as opposed to mathematics, and so on. So I found that a really useful way of working with that lattice, and I'm hoping others will find it useful as well, because the conversation then went on to, in each case, what are the constraints and affordances of technologies in this case? So those are 2 quite small comments. The last one is one that really only arose for me since I last spoke to Sarah. And that is thinking about the notion of proximity in relation to the notion of familiarity. And in a way, I see proximity as, it doesn't necessarily have to be this, but one can tend to think of it as being in the moment, physically present together. Whereas familiarity is not necessarily being in the moment, physically present together, but knowing your students. Knowing them either as a teacher, or more profoundly, I think, knowing them because you share their life circumstances, you come from the same kind of world, and you have a sense of who they are. And so it's a kind of once removed proximity, if you like. It's an extension, I think, of the notion of proximity rather than some kind of oppositional notion. I remember somebody, and I think again it was Sarah in a very different conversation, saying to me that this year teaching students at university, at most universities, will be very different and more difficult than last year, because at least last year the lecturers got to know the students for a month before they went onto online, and that little bit of familiarity fed into teaching the rest of the year. Even that, what seems to be really minimal bit of familiarity, helped the lecturers for the rest of the year. So how much more does it help teachers to know their students either as individual people or as people whose life that teacher also has a sense of, perhaps shares. A teacher comes from the same place, has a sense of, has various ways of being familiar with who the students are. So I'm not setting this up. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that familiarity, if you have familiarity, you don't need proximity. Proximity is crucial in the actual moment of teaching. But I think ideally you need both. So if I'm teaching a group of students I've never seen or heard of before, I know nothing about their lives, I don't have familiarity, but I do have proximity. But I think my lack of familiarity is going to undermine my teaching. So I think you need both, ideally. So then the question that arises for me is, what does teaching through technology do not only to proximity, but also to familiarity? And I think it undermines, it potentially might, depending again on the particular case, actually undermine both. So that's a little extension to the discussion that we've had so far. That's me done.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Heather. I appreciate your presentation. As you can see, the chat, as they say in social media, it's blowing up. So I'm going to pose some of the questions and share some of the comments there, particularly for those who are watching the stream on Facebook and they can't see the questions in the chat. So I think I will start with the comment and question by Enver Mutala. I think the concept of proximity is really important. Thanks to Sarah for profoundly important presentation. What about the language issue? And then from there, I'm going to move to Carolyn McKinney's comments as well, which also has an inclusion of the language issue. I think the concept of proximity, as Sarah outlines, it is very useful. The challenges for me are very similar in face-to-face. The best of online is similar to the best of contact, and loss of proximity in large-scale online is an exacerbation of the overcrowded classroom, tutorial, and lecture hall. For me, shared language enables proximity, so proximity can be structurally restricted in so many ways, not least monolingual language policy. Would you like to respond to that, Sarah and Heather?
Yes, thank you, Mukhtar. And I think the language issue is central and also illustrative. So proximity and being able to see the student obviously is premised on a mode of communication that you share, even in a one-to-one contact, and that would be language. That would be the way that we speak with each other. And so, yes, proximity without shared language is almost impossible. I'm also of a mind to reflect on how sort of trying to bring the language question into my own maths classroom about how did I try and establish proximity for students who were being alienated by the way that language was being used in textbooks and exams in curricula. And noticing how my ability to understand where my students' thinking was constantly working through this language filter, and my poor grasp of their first language as a shared mode of communication. But I think what Caro is saying is also very important to notice, how when we put machines between us, our ability to engage with the language question becomes, I think, harder. I think that the digital relays of language are always going to be ones that are making negotiation of meaning between us more difficult. If you're looking at something like the way that lexicons, you try and type Xhosa into WhatsApp and you watch how it autocorrects everything you write. So our prevailing social linguistic orders, including things like Anglo-normativity or at least Eurocentrism, are built into these machines. They're built into the parsing algorithms. They're built into the lexicons and vocabularies that the systems we use to talk together recognize as legitimate or marginalize. And so already the fact that we're working through a digital medium means that my students bringing whatever linguistic resources they have to the table, it's harder for me to make space for those. And so I think that there's something important there about the way that the medium itself, the digital relay, is making an already difficult translanguaging practice sometimes even harder. Also, if we're going to talk about material production, trying to overcome the enormous, I would use the word inertia of how much material is already available online in English, and trying to challenge that. It's not about whether it's possible, but I'm saying it's incredibly difficult because of how strong the power imbalance has become, and the way that those things are locked into objects now. They're locked into objects. Wikipedia is primarily in European languages. You know, trying to establish indigenous language Wikipedia is a huge undertaking that is going to encounter so many hegemonic forces. So I think the language example Caro's raised for us is a really nice one that shows contact is hard. It's already working through all these barriers to proximity. But my goodness, when you have to do it through digital, now you're adding even more barriers. Lovely question. Thank you, Caro. Thank you, Enver.
Yeah, may I add to that?
Go ahead, please.
So yeah, I also found that a really helpful question. Also to think further about this notion of familiarity. If familiarity signals something about having in common, knowing the other through what we have in common, through what we've shared, through what we know about each other, then that does not tell the whole language story, but I think language certainly comes into that story. Having in common a language, not only through, you know, understanding each other's sentences, but everything else that a language carries. So I think that's a really sort of helpful extension of the thinking around that. And like Sarah, I also think that the language, like Caro in fact said, the language issue is not about the technology, but the technology, it works through the technology, so it becomes relevant in the way the technology works as well. It's relevant in a classroom where it's face-to-face, even one-to-one, but the technology changes how one can or can't deal with it and how you're likely to deal with it.
Thank you. Professor Carolyn, would you like to respond?
You have to unmute him, Mukhtar.
Just to say
I did.
I mean, I agree with the comments that you made. I suppose what I'm also thinking is that for me, there is a problem when we talk about online or digital as a monolith, because the same problems that we have with massified face-to-face contact are there with massified online. And the amazing proximity and familiarity that we can develop in a small learning community can be enhanced with the digital, so it's very different, as Sarah said, teaching on WhatsApp with a small group of people who feel they've got a voice there and they can respond in whatever language they are comfortable with, versus delivery of a course in a pre-packaged way, where everything is monolingual in English. And so for me, the worst of the large scale stuff just transfers to the online, and the best of the small scale. We know that so many students are invisible in face-to-face as well. So that proximity, as you say, it's not guaranteed by face-to-face. But I think because of there's so much focus on the mode, it can distract from, actually it's like saying, well, are teachers a good thing, or are textbooks a good thing? Well, it depends on the textbook. It depends on what the teacher does.
I would like to ask Caro a question in response to that, though, which is, do you think, you used the word enhance, which I think is a really important point, and I do think that technology, Heather and I actually had this exact conversation while we were planning today. I said, it does strike me as a little ironic that here I am sending you WhatsApps about the presentation draft, and you are responding to me with voice notes, and we are having quite an intimate engagement technologically. What does that mean for the argument I'm making? And the thing that we came to, which I think Heather raised earlier, which is, I think digital relays can enhance pre-existing relationships, but I don't know how they work with ones that didn't exist prior to the digital relay. So having participated in so many WhatsApp groups with people I don't know and I've never met face-to-face, I personally, and this is just a subjective personal anecdote, I'm finding it very hard to establish a meaningful relationship in that way. So, what does that mean for the need to, technology can certainly enhance face-to-face, but can it replace it? And that's, I think, the important point, because a lot of the proponents of it would have it replace, not enhance.
I agree with you completely. It's absolutely can enhance, but in my experience, not replace.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, perhaps just to add, I think one way to talk about it is that the digital component adds another layer to what's already there. But at the same time, it adds a layer of a very special kind, which fixes and materializes and organizes and can be used to fix, material, and organize, even beyond the degree to which it has to. So it doesn't, the question is, how much does it introduce that's new, and what does it do to what's already there? I think often what it does things to what's already there, but does it in a way that's, as Sarah has said, difficult to undo, difficult to adjust.
I'd also like to pick up, if I may, Mukhtar, on some of the people noticing that proximity via technology is possible with the smaller groups, and certainly that was what I was trying to get at with my last slide. But the reason I pulled Marx into this picture is to foreground what is happening at a broader scale, which is that we are not equipping or organizing our education as a system outside of pockets of exception for small scale. And we can see the broader trends of massification and a drive to efficiency now, whether one wants to attribute that to neoliberal forces, whether one wants to take a more kind of classically Marxist approach to that, said that's kind of almost inevitable until some kind of grand social rupture. The point being that those of us who try to engage in those small scale engagements, where we do try and hold the proximity as much as we had in contact mode, are fewer and fewer, number one, and increasingly facing prevailing forces that would shut down small courses in favor of big ones, that would lay off teaching staff in order to get efficiency gains. And I think that efficiency drive is something that we can't ignore when we can't lift technology as separate from that. Marx is telling us that very clearly, that the technology is about getting the efficiency. Once you've spent all the money on the servers and the networks and the MOOCs and the VPNs and the Zoom licenses, etc., you've got to make it work for you. And so Marx is really clear on that when he talks about technology as embedded in a social moment where we are looking to, what he says, extracting relative surplus value. If we're going to go to all the effort of going online, we're not going to just keep our small classes. It's not, that's, I think, a really important part of what Marx is telling us. Thanks.
Sarah, if I can just get to some of the comments and questions, because we have 14 minutes remaining. A comment by Fiona Goliath: very grateful to have heard your critical interrogation and sorry to leave early for another meeting. Illustration of your very point of squeezing machines. Proximity is important with the larger family and community having access to what students are engaged with. However, depth of connection profoundly lacking. Moving on to some comments by John Fish Hodgson. I think what's crucial underpinning proximity is responsibility as responsibility, which matters because of unpredictability and diversity. People aren't all the same. Proximity, in a sense, enables richer responsibility, but so too can familiarity, as Heather is saying. John continues, also Sarah's ratio axis describes the ratio of teacher to others, but the interactions and responsibility between those in a class matters as much. Also, what Sarah's making explicit is deeper than present trends versus what's possible. Present trends aren't accidental. The intentional agenda of mainstream edtech comprises efficiency, scale, standardization, uniformity of students, modes, assessments, etc., transaction versus interaction, complete predictability. Moving over to Denise Sin's comments and question, and I'll pause there. Phew, indeed, Sarah, such a tightly woven argument. It has felt a bit like examining a pedagogic moment through a microscope. My question is, what else besides proximity as a focused lens would come into the big picture to make other elements of humanizing pedagogy possible within teaching and learning encounter, with multiple people involved in that encounter, as happens in classrooms? Denise continues, Heather is getting to an important aspect of what I was trying to get at. Absolutely, Heather. Knowing your students is really critical for establishing proximity, even when you go digital. I would draw attention to the 9 statements of awareness that our research at NMU helped to make explicit. Would be keen to hear Sarah and Heather's comments on this, see Zin and Rogers 2012. And then Zin comments, agree with John on the proximity with others, peers is also an important component and very possible to set up in ways that proximity gets sustainable and regular.
Sure. There's a lot.
There was one question in there, which I'm hoping you could maybe just respond to, and then I'll move on to the last set of comments and questions.
Please, could you lift the question out again, Mukhtar?
Okay, the question was, my question is, what else besides proximity as a focused lens would come into the big picture to make other elements of humanizing pedagogy possible within a teaching and learning encounter, with multiple people involved in that encounter as it happens in classrooms?
Well, I think the reason I went for proximity was that I see it as a precursor to humanizing pedagogic practices. However, those might be instantiated in a particular moment, whether, as I said, that's decolonizing curriculum, whether that is a broader movement towards the production of materials that put different forms of knowledges on different parity, on similar parity to each other, whether that is, you know, like linguistic justice, as Caro's been talking about. I think all of those are different aspects that could be formative towards humanizing pedagogical approaches. But what I liked about proximity and the way that Biesta leveraged responsibility in pedagogy is that it's the first step to whatever those other steps are. It's the first step of really being humane in a moment. Mukhtar, you've also said quite rightly that we need to be careful about thinking about humanizing as a verb we do to our students. And it's more about how there is a dialectic emergence of all of our humanity. I like that quote from that very problematic musical, The King and I. Such a problematic story, but there's a lovely quote from it, which is, it's a old and honest saying, but a very true thought, that if you are a teacher, by your students, you'll be taught. And that is that the humanizing is not just for the students, it's for everybody engaged in the pedagogic moment. But I don't think any of the other things that we have called humanizing are possible until we establish proximity, until we see each other and are open to subverting what we think is right and good into what we perceive the needs of the other, what they're telling us in that moment they need or want or desire. So I don't know if I would take proximity as one element of a humanizing pedagogy. I'm saying I think that it's an axis around which humanizing pedagogy can rotate. Heather, would you add to that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. It's not that they're not other things, but it's difficult to access those other things, or to somehow release, let those other things happen without proximity and familiarity.
Thank you.
What I understand you to be saying.
Is there just one precursor? No, there probably isn't. And I need to think about that more, Denise, because I don't want to give an off-the-cuff, ill-considered answer. I think rather what I'm saying is proximity is a necessary prerequisite, even if it's an insufficient one.
I agree.
Thank you. Sarah, I'm going to give you one comment and then 3 questions. Thanks, Sarah and Heather, for highlighting the centrality of both proximity and familiarity. This comes from Mike. And expanding our conceptual vocabulary in considering online learning. I think the offerances of online learning that are most indispensable are synchronous chats and webinars and asynchronous forum or written. They are, of course, also constrained by very large scale classes, but some of the limitations are compensated for by intensity of interaction and the opportunity to read over what has transpired in discussion. It's significantly different from face-to-face discussion, but not necessarily inferior, especially for smaller groups if these can be arranged. Your questions to Sarah and Heather, interesting and extremely relevant. How do students use technology to disconnect from the proximity with the teacher? That's the first question. The second, that question came from Enrico Murphy. The second from Hodgson is the assumption that proximity equals a safe and inclusive space to students. And then thirdly, from Ashley, what impact does the fragmentation of work and the loss of proximity when teaching through digital technology have on the teacher themselves? Is the movement online amplifying the alienation of teachers from meaning and purposefulness in their work?
Thanks, Mukhtar. I think those are 3 great questions, actually. And it's so interesting, again, how the issue of scale keeps coming up for the desire to hold on to what good technology can offer us. It's really interesting that comes up again and again. Students disconnecting from proximity and using the intermediary of the technological relay to do so. I think that's such a fascinating question, because, and it relates to the second question as well, about proximity being equivalent to safety. Biesta and Bauman are defining proximity as an ethical moment together. It's not about physical proximity. It's not even about visibility. It's about being together. And I think what's really interesting about a genuine proximity is that it is a discomforting process. It is a formative process in which you are asked to extend yourself beyond your comfort zone, both pedagogue and student. And probably that's where the best learning emerges. And so I think that's a beautiful question that I don't entirely have the answer to, but I think it's observing something very important, which is, you know, when you call someone into your office and you say, listen, we need to have a difficult conversation. We need to have a heart-to-heart here. You're wanting contact one-on-one because you recognize that that is the best form of engaging around difficult conversations. Yeah. I don't know about you. I don't like feeling uncomfortable. I find, what do they call it? Uncomfortable conversations is a very interesting sort of line of inquiry that some people have used to talk about a way of humanizing each other. But when we have this digital relay and we all kind of like, all right, I'm enough, I'm out, and you go, boom, stop my video, ignore my WhatsApp, turn off my blue ticks. It is interesting how technology does enable us to exit out the back door of uncomfortable conversations that perhaps we should stay present in. That's a really interesting question, is how much does it enable us to cut off from things that disquiet us? It does, definitely. So that's a very nice observation. I'm not sure who made that, but it's lovely. Thank you. Proximity being equivalent to safety, that's built into how, at least I'm defining proximity is about an ethical consideration. And now safety doesn't mean comfort. But if you are seeing the whole other person as a full human being, I think that there is something about trying to listen, trying to notice, paying attention, like I said, which is about, and this is what Bauman is saying, is that it's an ethical disposition that says, I see you as a whole human being, and I want to respect and support and what's the word I'm looking for? Nurture that. That's what Biesta means by proximity. And so I think that the concept of safety is built into that definition. But it's interesting to kind of wonder where the fuzzy lines are between safety and discomfort. Because what one person might say is feeling unsafe, another person will say, well, this is a stretching moment for me. So it's an interesting thing to play with, but proximity is defined here is meant to be about being for the other, being with the other. And Ashley's question about the alienation of teachers, my immediate response, but Heather, perhaps you would like to respond to this, is yes, very much so. In a way that is not dissimilar to, but perhaps amplified form of how teachers are already alienated from their work by labor division and the way that we're organizing education contact. So I think that the online form is just an acceleration of the pre-existing problems and perhaps a reification of those problems, ossifying it, sedimenting it into systems that will be difficult to untangle. Yes, I think so. Heather, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm a little bit I shouldn't really comment on how these things work in practice, because I'm probably, again, the only person in the room who stopped using technology when they took away the overhead projectors, and have never ever used, what are those bullet point slides that everybody subsequently used. So I certainly don't pretend to understand, for example, the effect of teachers on teachers from the inside. However, I do think there are 2 points that emerge for me from all these questions. The one is, again, emphasizing a point both Sarah and also Caro have made earlier about how technology doesn't constitute what happens in the interaction, it overlays it, but in the process changes it and makes certain things possible and other things, provides affordances and constraints and so on. So, for example, around the issue of the proximity of whether or not a space is safe. Yes, of course, the space might not be safe in other instances either. Students may feel connected or disconnected in your face-to-face context as well. So the question then is, given what you have in a particular context, how does this change, with the overlay of technology, with a mediation, more correctly, of technology? I think Sarah has emphasized something now, which she said right from the beginning, but which perhaps is easy to lose sight of, and perhaps sometimes, well, I and perhaps others have lost sight of it in the conversation and in the listening. And I really just want to, headline it around an ethical disposition, not just being about being in the same space, not even necessarily being about being in the same space, not just being about actually being familiar with the students, but being a disposition towards the student, and how that is folded into Sarah's notion of proximity, as she's taken it from Biesta and Bauman. And I think unavoidably, we have not spent as much time on that. But I think that's reflected a little bit in some of the questions and in some of the discussion. I think it's really important to put that, keep that in the center when we have these discussions.
Thank you, Heather.
Dr. Jacqueline, Dr. Sarah Black, thank you so much for today. I wish we had more time because more questions have been entered into the chat, and possibly we can continue this discussion at a later stage. But Dr. Heather Jacqueline, Dr. Sarah Black, thank you so much for your participation, your presentation, and your response today. As you can see, the audience really appreciated it. Many have asked me for a recording, and I can confirm that we will have a recording of this webinar uploaded onto the university's webpage. Colleagues, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. It has really been, quite insightful. A number of relevant points have been raised, and many have asked that we do continue this discussion. So we hope to continue exploring the possibilities of a humanizing pedagogy in online learning and teaching. And then a reminder to all of our participants of the upcoming Humanizing Pedagogy webinar, webinar 6 by Prof. Carol Rogers on Thursday. And then next week, Tuesday, we have the webinar by Prof. Nokanyo Mzanga and Dr. Mukimu Wing as well. Please visit the Humanizing Pedagogy webinar series webpage for more info. Participants and those on Facebook, thank you so much for joining us. It has been an honor and privilege. Do take care, be safe, and until we meet again online. All my best from Nelson Mandela University. Thanks again.